20 million people just watched Ed Gein on Netflix, but 99% of them missed what they were actually looking at. This isn't a story about a serial killer. This is a case study in how a human mind unravels, and why that should terrify you more than any monster ever could. Because here's what nobody's talking about. Ed Gein didn't start as a killer. He started as someone lonely, someone isolated, someone who lost every connection that kept him tethered to reality. And over 40 years, piece by piece, he stopped being human. Not through choice, through absence. Norman Bates exists because of him. Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, Hannibal Lecter. Every psychological horror character you've ever seen traces back to one farmhouse in Wisconsin. But here's the question that's going to haunt you. Why can't we stop thinking about him? Not because we're morbid, not because we celebrate evil, but because somewhere deep down we recognize something. The fragility of the boundaries we depend on. In the next hour, we're going to explore something most people won't touch. First, the real story. Not the Netflix dramatization. The actual psychological descent of a man who lived in total isolation for decades. What happened to his mind when every social mirror disappeared, when there was no one left to reflect humanity back to him. Second, the philosophy. Why existentialists like Sartre and Camus would look at Ed Gein's psychology as a case study in what happens when existence loses essence, when identity has no structure, when freedom becomes formlessness. Third, the mirror effect. Why directors, writers, and millions of people are obsessed with this story. Not because it's entertaining, because it reveals something about us, about the thin line between sanity and fracture, about what we're all capable of under the wrong conditions. And finally, the warning nobody's processing, because here's what's going to make you uncomfortable. The conditions that created Ed Gein haven't disappeared. They've gotten worse. The World Health Organization declared loneliness a global health epidemic in 2023. Social isolation now kills as effectively as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Mental health crises are spiking. People are losing touch with reality in ways that seemed impossible 20 years ago. Ed Gein is an ancient history. He's a preview of what happens when we ignore isolation until it's too late. So by the end of this, you're going to understand three things. 1. How a human mind actually fractures when connection disappears. 2. Why we're psychologically drawn to these stories and what that says about us. 3. What we're supposed to do with this knowledge, because understanding darkness without action is just voyeurism. This isn't going to be comfortable, but it's going to be honest, and it might be the most important thing you watch this year, because the psychology that created Ed Gein, it's not locked away in 1950s Wisconsin. It's happening right now, to people you know, maybe to you. So let's start at the beginning. Not with horror, but with loneliness. If you want more philosophy that goes into the darkness most channels won't touch, subscribe. This is where we explore the psychology others are afraid to examine. One man's loneliness reshaped the face of horror, not through what he did, but through what he revealed about us. There's a farmhouse in Wisconsin, empty now, forgotten by most. But its shadow stretches across every horror film you've ever seen. Norman Bates exists because of it. Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, Hannibal Lecter. The entire language of modern psychological horror traces back to one isolated man. Ed Gein never made a film, never wrote a book, never sought fame. He lived alone, died in obscurity, barely spoke to anyone for decades. But his psychology, his fractured, isolated, utterly detached mind became a mirror reflecting something we don't want to see, our own capacity for emptiness, for disconnection, for losing the boundaries that make us human. Directors saw it, writers saw it, the world saw it and couldn't look away, not because he was a monster, but because he was human, and that terrifies us more than any supernatural evil ever could. So why are we fascinated by darkness? Why does his story, told carefully, philosophically, without sensationalism, still matter? because it reveals a truth about the human condition. Isolation doesn't just make you lonely, it unmakes you. And understanding that might be the only thing that keeps us human. Before we go further, let's be clear about what this is. This isn't a true crime documentary. It's not a biography of violence. This is a psychological exploration, a philosophical investigation into how one man's fractured mind became the blueprint for cinematic horror. 1960, Alfred Hitchcock releases Psycho. Norman Bates, the quiet motel owner, dominated by his mother, fragmented personality, unable to distinguish between love and control. The film shocked audiences, not because of gore, there's barely any, but because of psychology, because Norman seemed so ordinary, so sympathetic, so human, until he wasn't. Hitchcock based Norman Bates on Ed Gein, not directly, not explicitly, but the psychology, the mother obsession, the isolation creating fracture. That came from understanding what happened in rural Wisconsin, 1974. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Leatherface, the masked killer in a house of horror. But look deeper. He's not a villain. He's a victim of his family, isolated, controlled, used. He doesn't speak, doesn't individuate. He's a tool, an extension of a toxic system. The filmmakers studied Ed Gein's psychology, the isolation, the maternal control, the complete absence of normal social development, and they asked what would that look like in a family system. 1991. The Silence of the Lambs. Buffalo Bill. Not the cannibalistic psychiatrist, that's a different archetype, but Buffalo Bill. The killer obsessed with transformation, with becoming someone else, because his own identity was never allowed to form. The writer Thomas Harris researched Ed Gein extensively, not the acts, the psychology. The desperate need for connection expressed through the only means a fractured mind understands. These aren't coincidences. These are artists recognizing something profound, that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural, they're psychological. They're what happens when human development goes catastrophically wrong. When isolation, control, and deprivation of connection create a mind that can no longer navigate reality. Ed Gein didn't create these characters. His psychology did. Or more accurately, our collective horror at recognizing that psychology could happen to anyone under the right circumstances. That's what we're exploring here. Not what happened, but why it matters. Why this one man's fractured existence became the foundation for how we tell stories about darkness. Because those stories aren't really about him. They're about us, about what we fear, about what we recognize, about the thin line between sanity and dissolution, and about what happens when human connection, the thing that keeps us grounded, disappears completely. 1906, Plainfield, Wisconsin. A farming community, small, isolated. The kind of place where neighbors are miles apart and winters are brutal. Ed Gein was born into isolation, not chosen, inherited. His family lived on the edge, a farmhouse distant from town, no close neighbors, no regular visitors. This wasn't unusual for rural America then, but the Geins took it further. His father, George, an alcoholic, largely absent, weak, a man who existed more as void than presence. His mother, Augusta, dominant, religiously extreme, controlling. She ran everything, the farm, the household, her children's minds. And her worldview was absolute. The world is corrupt. People are sinful. Trust no one. Need no one. Ed had one brother, Henry, older, less compliant, eventually questioning. But Ed absorbed everything, because he had nothing else. No friends, minimal schooling, no alternative perspective, no mirror except his mother's face. When you grow up in complete isolation, the person who controls your environment controls your reality. This is the psychology of deprivation. Humans are social creatures, not by preference, by biology. Our brains develop through interaction. We learn language by hearing others speak. We learn boundaries by testing them with peers. We learn empathy by experiencing diverse perspectives. We discover who we are by seeing ourselves reflected in multiple relationships. Ed had one relationship, his mother. And she didn't reflect him. She molded him, shaped him, suppressed him. Every natural developmental impulse, curiosity, independence, sexuality, identity formation, was met with religious condemnation. The world outside, evil. Women outside the family, whores, independence, betrayal of God and family. This creates what psychologists call enmeshment. When your identity doesn't develop separately from your caregiver, you can't distinguish your thoughts from theirs, your desires from their commands, yourself from their construction. You become an extension, not a person. Psychologically, this is devastating, because humans need individuation, the process of becoming separate, autonomous, capable of independent thought. Without it, you remain psychologically infantile, dependent, unable to navigate the world alone. But here's the tragedy. Ed wasn't aware this was happening. He thought his mother's worldview was reality, not one perspective, the only perspective. He thought her control was love, her restrictions were protection, her isolation was safety, because he had no comparison, no other experience, no alternative model of human connection. And his father, absent, passive, offering no counterbalance, no different example of masculinity or relationship, just absence. So Ed grew up, physically, 30 years, 40 years, but psychologically, he remained a child, dependent, unable to form connections outside the family system. His brother Henry started questioning, started working away from the farm, started seeing how abnormal their situation was. And then Henry died, 1944, circumstances unclear. Now it was just Ed and Augusta, the enmeshment total, complete. Until 1945, Augusta died. Ed was 39 years old. He'd spent 39 years with one human connection, one voice defining reality, one source of identity. And then, silence. Imagine living your entire existence in a small room with one other person. They tell you everything about the world outside. They define every word, every concept, every value. Your entire sense of what's real, what's acceptable, what matters, filtered through them. Then suddenly they're gone. The room is still small, but now it's empty. You're alone with thoughts that aren't fully yours, rules you never questioned, a worldview that only made sense when someone else was enforcing it. This is where Ed Gein's mind began to fracture, not through violence, through emptiness. The most dangerous human state isn't rage, it's detachment. When connection is completely severed, the mind doesn't just grieve, it loses its anchor to reality. Social norms are learned through social interaction. Boundaries are reinforced through human feedback. Empathy develops through diverse relationships. Without any of that, those structures dissolve, not immediately, gradually. Ed stopped leaving the house except for necessities. He sealed off most rooms, lived in a shrinking space surrounded by decay. Neighbors noticed him becoming stranger, more withdrawn. Odd, but this was rural 1940s America. Eccentricity was tolerated. Loneliness wasn't intervened upon. Mental health resources, non-existent. Community support, minimal. He was just the quiet man who lived alone on the edge of town. And in that isolation, something fundamental broke. Not his morality, because morality requires a social framework to exist. His connection to reality itself. The boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate, between living and dead, between self and other. These distinctions aren't innate, they're socially constructed, constantly reinforced through human interaction. Remove the interaction and they fade. Ed Gein didn't become evil. He became empty. A mind so isolated, so deprived of human connection, that it lost the framework for being human. To understand what happened to Ed Gein's psychology, we need to go deeper. Into Jung, into Freud, into the architecture of the unconscious mind. Carl Jung talked about archetypes, universal patterns in the human psyche that appear across cultures and time. The mother is one of the most powerful, not your actual mother, the archetype, the symbolic force, the primordial image of nourishment, protection, creation, but also control, devouring possession. The mother archetype has two faces, nurturing and consuming. Healthy development means experiencing both and integrating them, understanding that care can coexist with boundaries, that love doesn't require fusion. But Augusta Gein embodied only one face, the devouring mother. She didn't nurture Ed toward independence. She consumed his identity, made him an extension of herself. Her love was conditional on total obedience, total surrender, total abandonment of self. This is the dark side of the mother archetype Jung warned about. When a child can't separate from the mother psychologically, they remain trapped, psychologically infantile, unable to form independent identity. Jung called this the mother complex, not just dependency, fusion, the inability to distinguish where mother ends and self begins. Ed never escaped this fusion, even after Augusta died, especially after she died, because now the archetype had no physical form. It existed only in his mind, as voice, as judge, as the only relationship he'd ever known. Sigmund Freud would approach this differently. Through repression, Freud built psychoanalysis on one insight. What you suppress doesn't disappear. It transforms. Augusta didn't just discourage certain behaviors. She demonized basic human needs. Sexuality, evil, curiosity about women, sin, independence, betrayal, desire, corruption. Every normal developmental impulse was met with shame, guilt, religious condemnation. So those impulses didn't develop healthily. They didn't integrate into Ed's personality. They were repressed, buried, pushed into the unconscious. But repressed material doesn't vanish. It festers, grows, distorts. Freud talked about the Oedipal complex, the developmental stage where a child differentiates from the mother and forms independent identity. Healthy resolution means accepting that you're separate, that your mother is a person, not an extension of you, that you can love without fusion. Ed never resolved this. He remained psychologically fused with Augusta, and all the normal desires, for connection, for sexuality, for independence, for identity, were repressed so deeply that they couldn't surface normally. They emerged as fragments, distortions, behaviors that made no sense because they weren't integrated into a coherent self. This is what total repression creates, not absence of desire, mutation of desire, into forms that don't recognize normal boundaries, because the boundaries were never allowed to form. Now add Jung's concept of the shadow. The shadow is everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself, the parts of your personality that contradict your self-image. For most people, the shadow contains minor things, petty jealousies, small cruelties, selfish impulses we don't act on but know exist. Integration means acknowledging these parts, accepting them without letting them control you. But when repression is total, when an entire personality is suppressed for decades, the shadow becomes vast. Everything Ed Gein was never allowed to be lived in his shadow. Curiosity, sexuality, independence, normalcy, identity, connection. And with no healthy outlet, no social relationships, no therapeutic intervention, the shadow didn't integrate. It erupted. Not consciously. Ed didn't plan anything. He didn't have a coherent ideology or motivation. He acted from fragmentation, from a mind that had lost the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, desire and action, acceptable and unthinkable. Jung also discussed the anima, the unconscious feminine aspect of a man's psyche. Healthy development means integrating the anima, understanding and accepting feminine qualities within yourself, relating to women as complete people. But Ed's only model of femininity was Augusta, controlling, punishing, devouring. His anima wasn't integrated, it was poisoned. He couldn't relate to women as autonomous individuals because he'd never been allowed to. His only relationship with the feminine was through his mother, through control, fear, dependence, fusion. And when she died, he didn't grieve normally. He tried to recreate her, to maintain the only relationship he'd ever known. This is where psychology becomes tragedy, because what happened wasn't evil in the moral sense. It wasn't chosen. It was a completely fractured mind trying desperately to avoid the terror of total isolation, using the only framework it had, which was no framework at all. Freud and Jung both understood this. The human mind will do anything to avoid complete disconnection, even if the solution violates every social norm, even if it's grotesque. Because for a mind that fragmented, social norms don't exist anymore. There's only the desperate, unconscious need to not be alone. This doesn't excuse anything, but it explains something crucial. That monstrosity isn't born, it's created. Through isolation, through repression, through the destruction of normal human development. And that's far more terrifying than any supernatural evil, because it means we're all vulnerable. Under the right conditions, wrong conditions, any mind can fragment, any identity can dissolve, any person can lose the boundaries that make them human, not because they're inherently evil, because those boundaries require constant social reinforcement. Remove the reinforcement and they disappear. 1957. The world learned Ed Gein's story. The media exploded. Sensational headlines, shock, horror. But some people saw something else. Artists, writers, filmmakers who understood that the real horror wasn't the acts. It was the psychology, the how, the why, the disturbing reality that this was human, ordinary, not a supernatural monster, just someone whose mind had fractured so completely that the boundaries everyone else navigates automatically, he'd lost them entirely. This was terrifying in a new way, because it suggested that monstrosity isn't inherent. It's created through isolation, through control, through deprivation of human connection. And if it can be created, none of us are immune. Alfred Hitchcock was already developing Psycho when he learned about Ed Gein. The screenplay was based on a novel by Robert Bloch, who had been inspired by the Wisconsin case. But Hitchcock saw something deeper, an opportunity to explore psychological horror in a way cinema never had. Norman Bates wasn't a villain. He was a victim, dominated by his mother, unable to separate, fragmented into multiple personalities to cope with irreconcilable impulses. And audiences recognized him, not as a monster, as human. That was the genius and the horror. Norman seemed sympathetic, quiet, awkward, lonely, until the fracture revealed itself. Hitchcock understood what Ed Gein's story exposed, that evil doesn't announce itself. It appears as ordinary, as isolated, as human, and that's far more frightening than any obvious monster. Psycho changed cinema, not through gore, there's almost none, through psychology, through making audiences empathize with someone whose mind had broken, through forcing viewers to recognize this could be anyone, under the wrong circumstances. Tobe Hooper saw it differently. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't about one isolated man. It was about a system, a family that had isolated itself, created its own reality, lost all connection to normal social boundaries. Leatherface doesn't speak, doesn't individuate. He's a tool, an extension of a toxic family system. Sound familiar? Hooper understood that Ed Gein wasn't just an individual tragedy. He was a symbol of what happens when entire systems isolate, when families create closed realities, when no outside perspective can penetrate. The horror isn't the violence, it's the complete absence of empathy, of connection, of humanity. That's what isolation creates. Not individuals, systems, that operate by their own logic, completely disconnected from the world. Jonathan Demme and Thomas Harris took it further. The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill. Not Hannibal Lecter, he's a different archetype. The intellectual predator. That's not Ed Gein. But Buffalo Bill, the killer obsessed with transformation, with becoming someone else, because his own identity was never allowed to form. Harris researched Ed Gein's psychology extensively. The maternal control, the suppressed identity, the desperate need for transformation. Buffalo Bill isn't trying to harm people in his fractured understanding. He's trying to become whole, to construct an identity that was never permitted to develop naturally. It's tragic, horrifying, and deeply psychological. These filmmakers weren't exploiting Ed Gein's story. They were translating it from true crime into myth, into archetype, into stories that explore something fundamental about human psychology. Why were audiences fascinated? Why do these films endure? Because they let us confront our own darkness safely. Through fiction, we can explore what happens when human development fails completely, when isolation destroys empathy, when repression creates fracture, when the boundaries that keep us human dissolve. We're not celebrating violence. We're studying the absence of connection. And that absence, that's what truly terrifies us, because we recognize it, not in ourselves necessarily, but in the potential, in the fragility of sanity, in how dependent our humanity is on consistent social connection. These films work because they're not really about serial killers. They're about what we fear becoming. What we fear exists in the shadows of total isolation. Norman Bates is what happens when maternal control never releases. Leatherface is what happens when a family system completely disconnects from reality. Buffalo Bill is what happens when identity formation is so suppressed that transformation becomes desperate and distorted. These aren't villains. They're warnings about the importance of connection, of community, of intervention when isolation becomes pathological. Ed Gein's psychology became the language of modern horror because it revealed something true, that the scariest monsters are the most human ones, the ones that show us what we could become if everything that keeps us grounded, connection, empathy, social boundaries, disappeared. That's not entertainment. That's existential terror. And that's why these stories endure, why they matter. Not because they glorify darkness, because they illuminate it. They show us where the boundaries are, by showing us what happens when they're gone. So we've seen how Ed Gein's isolation destroyed his connection to reality, how total control under his mother, followed by total absence, fractured his mind, and how that fracture became the blueprint for every psychological horror character we know. But here's where it gets deeper. This isn't just about Ed Gein anymore. What we're about to explore is the universal psychology underneath, the philosophical framework that explains how any human mind can dissolve when isolated long enough. Because isolation doesn't just damage you psychologically, it dismantles the very structures that make you human. Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Hannah Arendt, philosophers who studied what happens when existence loses meaning, when identity has no structure, when humanity becomes optional. Ed Gein is the case study, but this is about all of us. Let's step back from Ed Gein specifically and look at what his story represents philosophically. The psychology of the outsider, the alienated, the isolated. This isn't just about one man in Wisconsin. It's about a fundamental human vulnerability. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about existence preceding essence, the idea that we're not born with fixed identities. We create ourselves through choices, through actions, through relationships. But what happens when you have no relationships? when there are no mirrors to show you who you're becoming. Your essence, your identity, doesn't form normally. You exist, but you don't cohere. You become, in Sartre's terms, radically free. But freedom without structure isn't liberation. It's terror, formlessness, the inability to navigate reality because you have no fixed point. Ed Gein existed in this state. After his mother died, he had no social relationships to reflect identity back to him. No structure, no boundaries, no feedback telling him when he'd crossed lines, because those lines are socially constructed. They require other people to maintain them. Albert Camus explored similar themes: the absurd, the recognition that life has no inherent meaning. Most people cope through connection, through creating meaning together, through shared reality. But what happens when you're completely alone, when there's no shared reality, no consensus about what matters? Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the struggle itself, even without purpose. But that requires a kind of philosophical strength, an ability to create meaning alone. Ed Gein didn't have that strength. He had dependency, programming, the voice of his mother replacing his own thoughts. When she died, he wasn't free. He was unmoored, lost, grasping for any structure. And the only structure he knew was her. So he tried to maintain her presence through whatever fractured means his broken mind could conceive. This is the psychology of the outsider taken to its extreme. Not romantic isolation, not chosen solitude, not the artist alone in their studio creating meaning, but pathological isolation, the kind that doesn't build character, it destroys it. Modern psychology understands this better now. We know that social isolation is as dangerous as smoking, that loneliness kills, not metaphorically, literally, through stress, through depression, through the deterioration of both mind and body. But we also know something else. That isolation doesn't just harm, it distorts. It changes how you perceive reality, how you process information, how you relate to other humans. Studies on solitary confinement show that even short periods of complete isolation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, loss of emotional regulation. Now imagine a lifetime, not in a cell, in a farmhouse, with one controlling relationship, then none. What happens to empathy? The ability to recognize others as fully human with their own experiences and rights. Empathy develops through diverse social interaction, through seeing yourself in others, through theory of mind, understanding that other people have internal lives as complex as your own. Without social interaction, empathy doesn't develop normally, or it atrophies. Others become less real, less fully human, more like objects, or obstacles or resources. This is dehumanization, not through ideology, through deprivation. When you're isolated long enough, other people stop feeling real. They become abstractions, characters, means to an end rather than ends in themselves. This is what happened to Ed Gein's mind, not because he was born without empathy, but because isolation eroded it, year after year, decade after decade, until other people weren't fully real anymore, until boundaries that should be absolute between person and object, living and dead, became negotiable. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the face of the other, the idea that when you truly see another person, their face, their humanity, you're confronted with infinite responsibility. You can't harm them, because their face reveals their vulnerability, their humanity, their demand to be treated as a person. But what if you never learn to see the face of the other? What if isolation means you never develop that recognition? Then others remain abstractions, and abstract beings can be used, manipulated, treated as objects. This isn't evil in the traditional sense. It's absence, the absence of the development that makes morality possible. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, not dramatic wickedness, just the absence of thought, the inability to see from another's perspective. Ed Gein wasn't a philosophical villain. He was a case study in what happens when normal moral development never occurs, when isolation and control prevent the formation of the very faculties that make ethical behavior possible. This is why his story matters beyond true crime, beyond horror films, because it reveals how fragile our humanity is, how dependent on constant social reinforcement. We like to think morality is inherent, that we're born knowing right from wrong. But we're not. We learn it. Through relationships, through feedback, through seeing ourselves reflected in the humanity of others. Remove those relationships and morality doesn't just weaken, it dissolves, not into active evil, into emptiness, into the inability to navigate ethical reality because the framework for doing so was never built. This is the lesson, not about Ed Gein specifically, about isolation, about disconnection, about what we risk when we allow people to fall through the cracks, when loneliness becomes pathological and we look away, when mental illness goes untreated because of stigma or lack of resources, when someone's entire social world shrinks to nothing and nobody intervenes, because the consequences aren't just individual suffering. They're the dissolution of the very capacities that make us human. Empathy, connection, the ability to see others as fully real. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities, not just for happiness, for humanity itself. Now we understand the mechanism, how isolation removes the social feedback that constructs identity, how existence without essence creates formlessness, how radical freedom without structure becomes psychological terror. But that raises a harder question. Why are we so fascinated by this? Why do millions of people watch these stories? Why can't we look away from fractured minds and psychological horror? Is it just morbid curiosity? Number. It's recognition. We see something in these stories that we don't want to admit. The fragility of our own boundaries. The thin line between connection and dissolution. This is the mirror effect, and it reveals more about us than it does about Ed Gein. Because when you watch Psycho, you're not just seeing Norman Bates. You're seeing what you could become under the wrong circumstances. So why are we drawn to these stories? Why does Ed Gein's psychology still fascinate? Not because we're morbid, not because we celebrate darkness, but because we recognize something uncomfortable, something true, the fragility of the boundaries we depend on. When you watch Psycho, you don't just see Norman Bates as a monster, you see him as human, sympathetic even, until the fracture reveals itself. And that moment, that recognition that someone so ordinary could become something so broken, that's what haunts you, because it suggests those boundaries aren't as solid as we pretend, that under the wrong circumstances with enough isolation and damage, any mind could fracture. This is the mirror effect. These stories reflect our fears back to us, not about external threats, about internal fragility, about what happens when the structures that keep us sane, connection boundaries, social reinforcement, disappear. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the Stanford prison experiment, talked about the Lucifer effect, how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil under certain conditions, not because they're inherently bad, but because situations can override individual morality. Authority, social pressure, dehumanization, isolation, anonymity. Remove normal social constraints and behavior changes dramatically. Ed Gein's situation was similar but more extreme, not a temporary experiment, a lifetime, complete isolation, total control, then total absence of structure. The miracle isn't that his mind fractured, it's that any mind wouldn't. Neuroscientist James Fallon studied psychopathic brains, including his own. He discovered he had many of the brain markers associated with psychopathy, low empathy, reduced emotional response. But he wasn't a criminal. Why? Social connection, a loving family, community ties. The neurology predisposed him, but environment determined outcome. This is the insight we keep rediscovering. Biology isn't destiny. Environment matters. Connection matters. Ed Gein likely had no predisposition to violence, no genetic markers, no neurological abnormalities, just isolation, just repression, just the complete absence of healthy human development. And that was enough. This is what makes these stories powerful. They're not about the monster out there. They're about the monster that could emerge in here, in any of us, under the wrong conditions. That's not fatalistic. It's empowering, because if darkness is created rather than innate, it can be prevented. Through connection, through intervention, through refusing to let isolation become pathological, through recognizing when someone's social world is shrinking, when loneliness becomes dangerous, when mental health deteriorates without support. These stories teach us to look, to notice, to care before it's too late, not just for their sake, for everyone's. Because isolated people don't just suffer alone. Their fracture creates ripples, harm, tragedy that extends far beyond their individual pain. This is why studying darkness matters. Not to glorify it, to understand it, to see where the boundaries are by observing what happens when they're gone, to recognize the signs of deterioration before fracture becomes irreversible, to value connection not just as comfort but as necessity, as the thing that keeps us human. Modern psychology has embraced this. Loneliness is now recognized as a public health crisis, not just because it makes people sad, because it makes them sick. Mentally, physically, socially. Social isolation increases risk of dementia, heart disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, suicide. And in extreme cases, in cases like Ed Gein, it creates something worse than illness. It creates absence. The absence of the development that makes morality, empathy, and humanity possible. So when we study these cases, we're not indulging in morbid curiosity. We're learning survival skills, social survival skills. How to recognize isolation in ourselves and others. How to maintain connection even when it's difficult. How to intervene before loneliness becomes pathology. How to build communities that don't let people fall through the cracks. Because Ed Gein's story isn't ancient history. It's a warning that remains relevant. That isolation is always dangerous. That connection is always necessary. That the boundaries keeping us human require constant maintenance. Through relationships, through community, through refusing to let anyone become so alone that they lose touch with shared reality. That's the lesson. That's why we keep telling these stories, not to scare ourselves, to remind ourselves of what we need, of what we risk losing, of why connection isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything that makes us human. We've journeyed through darkness, not for its own sake, but to understand something essential. Ed Gein's story isn't about one man. It's about the human condition, about what happens when the structures we depend on, family, community, connection, boundaries, collapse completely. His mind didn't fracture because he was born broken. It fractured because he lived an entire life in isolation, controlled by one relationship, then abandoned to none, never allowed to develop normally, never given the social feedback that creates empathy, boundaries, identity. And when that feedback disappeared entirely, so did his ability to navigate reality. This could have been prevented. Not easily, not obviously, but it could have been. If rural mental health resources existed in 1940s Wisconsin, if community members recognized pathological isolation and intervened, if there had been any therapeutic support, any social safety net, any recognition that this level of loneliness was dangerous. But there wasn't, and a mind broke, and the consequences echoed through decades, not just in what happened, in what it revealed about human vulnerability, about how fragile our sanity is, how dependent on constant social reinforcement, about what we risk when we allow anyone to become completely alone. So now we've looked into the mirror. We've seen how Ed Gein's mind fractured. We've understood the philosophy of isolation and identity collapse. We've recognized why these stories haunt us, because they reveal our own fragility. But here's the question nobody's asking. What are we supposed to do with this? Because understanding darkness without action is just entertainment. And this isn't entertainment anymore. The conditions that created Ed Gein haven't disappeared. They've gotten worse. Epidemic loneliness, rising isolation, mental health crises everywhere, people losing connection, losing reality, losing humanity. Not in 1950s Wisconsin. Right now, in 2025. So what do we actually do about it? That's what we're covering next. This is the part that matters most. "20 million people watched Ed Gein on Netflix. But here's what almost everyone missed. This isn't ancient history. It's a warning about 2025. We've covered Ed Gein's crimes, the philosophy of how isolation destroyed his mind, why we can't stop thinking about his story. Now the question nobody's asking, what are we supposed to do with this? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The conditions that created Ed Gein haven't gone away. They've gotten worse. The World Health Organization declared loneliness a global health epidemic in 2023. Social isolation is now as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we're seeing the effects everywhere. Rising mental health crises, increasing social withdrawal, people losing touch with the reality in ways that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. Ed Gein isn't just a horror story. He's a case study in what happens when we ignore isolation until it's too late. So what do we actually do about it? Here's the lesson Ed Gein's fractured existence teaches us. Humanity isn't permanent, it's practiced. Every day, through connection, through seeing each other as fully human, through maintaining the social bonds that keep us grounded in reality. Remove that practice and humanity doesn't just weaken, it dissolves. Not into active evil, into absence. The absence of empathy, of boundaries, of the moral framework that makes us capable of recognizing others as real. This sounds abstract, but it's not. Ed Gein had no genetic predisposition to violence, no brain abnormalities, no inherent evil. He had isolation, complete total pathological isolation for over 40 years. And that was enough to unmake him. Not because he was weak, because that's what isolation does. To anyone, given enough time and complete disconnection. The neuroscience is clear. The psychology is settled. The case studies are overwhelming. Isolation doesn't just hurt. It distorts reality itself. And we're living through the most isolated period in human history. So what do we do? 3 things. Personal, social, and structural. First, recognize your own vulnerability. You're not immune to isolation's effects. None of us are. If you're isolated right now, if your social world has been shrinking, if weeks go by without meaningful conversation, that's not weakness. That's danger. A warning sign that requires action before it becomes pathological. Reach out, even when anxiety tells you not to. Even when depression says you're bothering people, even when it feels impossible. Connection doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be deep or profound or life-changing. It just has to exist. A conversation with a stranger, a support group, therapy, online communities if physical ones aren't accessible. Anything that reminds you that other people are real, that you're not alone in the universe, that shared reality still exists. Because here's what Ed Gein's case reveals. The longer you're isolated, the harder it becomes to connect. Isolation creates a feedback loop. You withdraw because connection feels difficult. Connection feels difficult because you've withdrawn. The cycle accelerates. Breaking it requires action before it hardens into something permanent. Second, notice others. When someone's social world shrinks, when they withdraw, when isolation becomes obvious, don't look away. Don't assume someone else will help. Don't wait until it's too late. Check in. Reach out. Offer connection even when it's awkward. A conversation could change everything. An invitation. An acknowledgement that they exist and matter. This isn't dramatics. It's documented intervention science. Social connection is protective, not just against loneliness, against the distortion of reality that happens when someone has no external feedback about what's normal. Ed Gein had nobody. For decades. No one checking in. No one noticing his deterioration. No one intervening before his mind fractured completely. That's preventable. Not through professional intervention necessarily. Through basic human attention. Seeing when someone's struggling. Offering presence. Refusing to let people become invisible. It sounds simple. It is simple. But it's also life-saving. Because isolation kills. Not just metaphorically. Literally. Through suicide, through deteriorating mental health, through the erosion of everything that keeps us human, and in extreme cases, through the complete dissolution of moral boundaries. Third, we build systems that don't let people fall through cracks. This isn't just individual responsibility, it's collective. Mental health resources that are actually accessible. Social programs that connect isolated people. Community spaces where connection happens organically. Systems that recognize isolation as the public health emergency it is. Right now, we treat loneliness like a personal failing. Like if someone's isolated, they should just try harder to connect. But Ed Gein tried. He joined community organizations. He babysat for neighbors. He attempted connection. But after decades of maternal control and abuse, he didn't know how. His social skills never developed. Connection felt impossible. And nobody noticed. Nobody intervened. Nobody built the bridge he couldn't build himself. That's the system failure. We need communities that actively prevent isolation, that notice when someone's withdrawing, that respond before loneliness hardens into pathology. Schools that teach social-emotional skills. Workplaces that prioritize human connection over productivity metrics. Neighborhoods designed for interaction, not isolation. Mental health care that's preventive, not just reactive. That catches deterioration early before someone loses touch with reality. This sounds idealistic, but it's not. It's practical public health. Because the alternative, waiting until isolation creates tragedy, is far more expensive. In human suffering, in social costs, in preventable harm. The conditions that created Ed Gein exist everywhere. Rural isolation, urban loneliness, digital connection that feels real but isn't. People slipping through cracks, becoming invisible, losing their grip on shared reality. And we're doing the same thing society did in 1940 Wisconsin. Nothing. Assuming someone else will help. Assuming isolated people will figure it out. Assuming the problem will resolve itself. It won't. Isolation accelerates. Mental health deteriorates. Reality becomes negotiable when there's no social reinforcement of boundaries. And by the time we notice, it's often too late. Prevention requires attention. Resources. Systems designed to catch people before they fall. Communities where everyone is seen. Where social connection is treated as infrastructure, not luxury. Where isolation is recognized as the emergency it is. That's how we prevent the next Ed Gein. Not through fear. Through deliberate structural commitment to ensuring nobody becomes completely alone. Here's the paradox. Studying darkness teaches us to value light. Horror films inspired by Ed Gein, Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs. They're not celebrating violence. They're processing collective anxiety. About isolation. About fragility. About what lurks in the gaps when connection disappears. These stories are warnings, not entertainment. Warnings about what happens when human development fails. When isolation becomes total. When nobody intervenes. And warnings work. They make us vigilant. They make us recognize danger before it's too late. That's why Ed Gein's story still matters 70 years later. Not because of what he did, because of what he represents. The ordinary person, the outsider, the isolated mind that fractures when all connection is severed. That could be anyone under the wrong circumstances. Not because we're all potential criminals, because we're all dependent on connection for our humanity. Remove connection long enough and anyone loses their grip on empathy, on boundaries, on the moral framework that keeps us human. That's terrifying, but it's also empowering, because if darkness is created rather than innate, it can be prevented through connection, through intervention, through refusing to let isolation become pathological, through recognizing the signs early, through building communities that catch people before they fall, through treating connection not as comfort but as necessity, as the foundation of everything that makes us human. That's prevention, not through grand gestures, through ordinary human decency, consistently applied, through seeing each other, reaching out, refusing to let anyone become invisible, through building systems that prioritize human connection over convenience or profit, through recognizing that when we allow people to fall through cracks, we all pay the price, in tragedy, in harm, in the dissolution of the social fabric that keeps everyone sane. So here's what 20 million Netflix viewers need to understand. Ed Gein's story isn't about one man in rural Wisconsin. It's about all of us, about the choice we face constantly, between connection and isolation, between seeing others as human or letting them become abstractions, between noticing when someone's struggling or looking away until it's too late. Every time we reach out to someone who's withdrawn, we prevent future harm. Every time we notice loneliness and respond with kindness, we strengthen the bonds that keep everyone grounded. Every time we choose connection over convenience, we practice the humanity that isolation tries to destroy. This isn't dramatic, it's daily. Small acts, conversations, presence. But accumulated over time across communities, these acts create the environment where minds don't fracture, where isolation doesn't become pathological, where everyone has connection to shared reality. Netflix's Monster showed you the horror, the crimes, the fractured mind. But it couldn't show you this. That horror was preventable. Not easily, not obviously, but preventable. If mental health resources had existed in 1940s Wisconsin, if community members had recognized pathological isolation and intervened, if anyone had noticed one lonely man slipping further from reality every year, but nobody did, and a mind broke, and the consequences echoed through decades. We can't change what happened to Ed Gein, but we can change what happens next. By recognizing isolation as danger, by treating connection as necessity, by building communities where nobody falls through the cracks, by practicing empathy deliberately, by seeing each other as fully human, by refusing to let anyone become so alone they lose touch with reality. That's the lesson. That's why his story matters, not as entertainment, as warning, as reminder, that humanity isn't permanent, it's practiced.